I am Daniel Giraldi. I am the Economic Education Coordinator here at the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom at SMU Cox. And we have an outstanding series of presentations today. Our first presenter is Meg Tazinski with Markets and Governments. Meg is a colleague of mine here at the O'Neill Center, and she completed her PhD recently at George Mason University in economics. George Mason is widely known as one of the centers par excellence for public choice. And she is going to be talking to us about the effects of governments and markets and where they intersect. And well, without further ado, Dr. Tazinski.
Thank you, Daniel. So, as you said, I'm Meg Tazinski. I'm the Assistant Director of the O'Neill Center for Global Markets and Freedom here at Southern Methodist University, and a research assistant professor as well. And so public choice may be an unfamiliar term to a lot of you. Public choice is simply using the tools of economics to understand non-market decision making. In fact, that was the original name for the School of Public Choice, was non-market decision making. So public choice uses the tools of economics to make sense of political sort of actions and interactions. And so in this sort of way of thinking, it's a very, I would say, a micro grounded approach to economics. Individuals are the units of analysis, and it's worth emphasizing here that individuals are the unit of analysis because it makes sort of the rest of the discussion make a lot more sense. So the incentives are the real focus here, and the fact that the incentives of individuals differ in the public and private sector, but importantly, self-interest still drives people. So this is really contrary to the sort of public interest view of politics that a lot of people tend to have. The politicians are simply out to serve some notion of the public interest. Public choice, it sort of de-romanticizes that idea and says, no, people are the same people, whether they're in the marketplace or whether they're in sort of the political sphere. Certainly people can have other interested motives, but we should also evaluate how politicians are self-interested and how this sort of affects how they act and interact in the political sphere. So markets and governments simply represent alternative ways of providing public goods and services in this sort of public choice view. Exchange occurs in both sectors, as I'll elaborate on throughout this. This is a two-part series on public choice, so you get to hear me all morning. But in this sort of section, we'll talk a little bit about the exchange, and we'll touch on it a little bit more in the second part. But exchange occurs in both sectors, both the public and the private sector. But politics can be thought of as what one of my colleagues at George Mason calls a peculiar sort of exchange process. And I'll describe that a little bit more as we go on here today. Market exchange requires consensus. Two people agree that they'll each be better off as the result of an exchange, and therefore an exchange is made. Political exchanges, in contrast, require the agreement of majorities. And so because these different types of exchange operate within a different sort of incentive structure, this sort of changes the outcomes and the modes of operation of these different types of market actors versus political actors. So I'm going to sort of harp on this self-interest idea, which I'm sure is very familiar to everyone here, but in the context of discussing politics as sort of a market process, it's important to very clearly define how we use self-interest in this context when we say that politicians, like market actors, are self-interested. So this is maybe the most crucial insight of this public choice way of thinking, that people are self-interested in both the public and the private sphere. But self-interest is not, I'm going to emphasize, not a synonym for selfish. People routinely put the needs of others before themselves. They behave altruistically. Politicians very often do go into politics because they have some idea that they want to promote the public good. They want to, if not the public good, at least help the people in their state in some way. Self-interest, however, simply means in this context that people tend to consider the interest of themselves and their loved ones before considering the interests of those more distant. And so it can simultaneously be true that politicians have these other regarding motives, but also are self-interested, as are people in other vocations. Another way of sort of saying this, and maybe putting it more simply, is that people respond to incentives. People, whether they're in the private sector or in the public sector, evaluate the costs and the benefits of any decision before deciding how to proceed. And when the costs rise or the benefits fall, people will be less likely to engage in those sorts of activities. And so, one example that I like to use is when you look at recent sort of hurricane outpourings of relief and hurricane relief efforts. It's very easy. The cost of just giving money is relatively low. And the benefits that people, you get a good feeling by giving money for hurricane relief efforts, or giving money to hurricane relief efforts. The cost of actually going to the site and helping rebuild and engaging in those sorts of actions is much higher. And so it's unsurprising that people are more likely to, when evaluating the costs and benefits, to give money than to actually travel to the site and engage in rebuilding efforts. And so we'll kind of build on this idea throughout this first part, is that politicians evaluate the costs and the benefits of their actions before making a decision. And while this seems sort of trivial in some ways, the implications are actually pretty substantial. So in the marketplace, self-interest is pretty unproblematic, as I'm sure a lot of you discuss in your classes. When people make purchases in the marketplace, both the costs and the benefits accrue to themselves. People would not make purchases of, an iWatch or an Apple Watch unless they thought the $249 that they were going to spend on the Apple Watch was less valuable to them than the watch itself. And producers would be unwilling to sell the watch unless they valued the $249 more than having an extra watch in their inventory. So self-interested producers, through sort of an invisible hand process, they're concerned with providing the best product possible at the lowest possible price. And through this process, we see these continual pushes towards higher quality and lower prices in the marketplace. If a product's not selling well, producers have to, there's a little bit of figuring out exactly what's going on, but producers need to either lower their price or improve their quality or figure out why consumers aren't purchasing that good in order to remain competitive. So, as I just said, competition in the marketplace is not only unproblematic, it's actually pretty beneficial. It helps keep quality high, it helps keep prices low, and it encourages innovation. But sort of continuing to draw this parallel between self-interest in the marketplace versus self-interest in politics. Self-interest in politics is a little more problematic because the incentives of the system within which political actors operate are different and lead to these sorts of issues. So there's this idea that is discussed a lot in public choice, this logic of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. So politicians aren't playing with their own money, they're playing with other people's money. And they're concerned with pleasing their constituents. And so their constituents, or particular subsets of their constituents, can be thought of as a concentrated benefit. But the costs of any government good or service or activity are diffuse. They're spread across all taxpayers. And so when politicians are listening to, the needs of their constituents, and we want more agricultural subsidies if you're living in Nebraska or a sort of Midwestern state, or we want more wetlands conservation if we're living in Florida. Politicians hear that, and they want to please their constituents because that's how politicians remain in business, so to speak. You've got to get more votes to stay in office, and that's sort of the way politics operates. So they listen to those concentrated benefits, but then the costs are diffuse. They're spread across all taxpayers. And this is problematic because people are relatively more willing to put up with programs they dislike when they know they only pay a very small portion of the total bill. So if the costs are spread all across all taxpayers, for any individual taxpayer, even if you dislike the agricultural subsidy program or the wetlands conservation program, you may only pay, a few cents every year through your taxes for any particular program. And so your incentive as a taxpayer to sort of work against those programs is very small. The benefit to you is saving a few cents, each year. That's not worth your time to engage in activities to push back against those sorts of programs. The benefits for the concentrated interests are huge. That can add up to, millions or billions of dollars, when you aggregate up a few cents from every individual taxpayer. So their incentives to push for a program that they like are enormous. So it's personally more beneficial to push for spending that directly benefits you than against spending that you dislike. So politicians, because this is the way the process operates, these are the incentives built into the system, they hear more pro-spending arguments than anti-spending arguments. And so this causes overall spending to be higher than it otherwise would be, even if, when polls are taken, people generally say, oh, I would prefer to have lower taxes. Sure, everyone would prefer to have lower taxes, but when it comes to that particular program that you're interested in perpetuating, you want to maximize the amount of spending on that sort of program. So it can simultaneously be true that you think your tax bill is too high, but you want spending on the programs that you like. And through this process, this logic of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs is so crucial, because it's through this process that sort of causes overall spending levels to grow and grow and grow over time. So a problem that we run into, a sort of related problem that we run into when discussing sort of politics in the framework of market processes, is we can think of politicians in some ways as sellers of legislation or sellers of regulation, sellers of government-provided goods and services. So politicians who draft legislation are sellers, and I say sellers in scare quotes, because they're not the same as sellers in the market. They're sellers who don't actually produce in the same way that sellers in the market are also the producers of these goods and services. They outsource the production to a third party. So there isn't the need, in the same way as there is in the marketplace, to ensure that prices remain low, to ensure that those higher quality outputs, they can therefore use higher quality outputs than they otherwise might, because again, they're not playing with their own money. They're not concerned with some bottom line in the same way that market producers are concerned with turning a profit. That doesn't enter into sort of the political seller's calculus. So they don't have that same discipline that the profit and loss mechanism provides to market producers, which is how government projects are often end up being more expensive than similar private projects. And there's an empirical literature that sort of details, looks at similar projects in the public sector and the private sector. And because the incentives to turn a profit are not there in the public sector, they often end up being more expensive because they lack that sort of market discipline in the same way. So that's why at the beginning I said politics is sort of a peculiar business, because you do have sellers in some sense, but the discipline of the market is not there in the same way. So we can also think of citizens who use, for example, if we're looking at a public park project, the politicians are the sellers of that, legislation. The people in their community want a public park. They want to please the people in their community, and so they can be the sellers of that legislation. The citizens who are consumers can be thought of in some way, who use that park can be thought of as consumers, but they don't pay the full cost of their consumption. And when you don't pay the full cost of something, you're more likely to support it. So if you think about a everyday market transaction, like going and buying a sandwich, you're a real consumer in that sort of example. You pay the full cost of the sandwich. You wouldn't have paid for that sandwich unless you thought the value you were going to get from that sandwich was worth more than the $5 or whatever you paid for it. And you get to enjoy the full benefit of that sandwich. Citizens who use the park get to enjoy the benefits of the park without paying the full cost. The costs are, again, diffuse. They're spread across all taxpayers. in whatever particular district we're looking at here. And so when you don't pay the full cost of something, you're much more likely to support that thing. And those who don't, and this is crucial as well, those who don't want the project but still live in the district and have to pay taxes, still have to pay for it, are losers in some way in the political exchange process. They have to pay for it even though they didn't want it, because the way that sort of politics operates, as I said earlier, is within sort of a majority rule framework than in a consensus type framework. And it's that sort of majority rule framework that makes this self-interest within politics so pernicious at times. So markets have this built-in mechanism for ascertaining value, and that's prices. And as I said, prices don't really operate in the same way in the political sphere. So it's certainly true that when people aren't buying a product, there's a little bit of interpretation that entrepreneurs have to engage in. Is it the price is too high? Is it that the quality is too low that are causing people not to want my particular good or service? But they have a very strong incentive, because it's their bottom line that is hurt if they don't figure out what consumers want and how to update their strategy accordingly. In the government, however, as we just said, there aren't buyers of public goods and services in the same way that there are in markets. And so, politicians and bureaucrats can in some ways rely on market prices as a guide to the value of their product or their project, but there aren't prices that are created in the same way as prices are created through interaction in the marketplace. So yeah, political actors have some metrics. They can rely on sort of prices that are created in a marketplace to create some metric of value. They can use other sorts of metrics of value, how many people are using the park, and there are ways where you can evaluate, are we doing better or worse, but it's not as direct of an evaluation as a market actor has in just being able to look at, am I turning a profit or am I experiencing a loss? So they have no good way of really determining if the resources used in their projects or products would have been more valuably employed elsewhere. As we all know, most resources are scarce, and scarce resources have opportunity costs. And so resources that are used in sort of producing political goods and services, whether that's real resources, human resources, they have alternative uses elsewhere. And without prices, it's hard to evaluate whether the resources being used in a government project are being used in their most highly valued use. Again, they're playing with other people's money, and so they can't really, they can pay more than a similar private sector, entrepreneur may, decide to pay. And so it's very hard to say, would that, in the same way that the market does, would those resources have been more valuably have been employed in a different public sector project or in a private sector project of some sort? So, like I said, resources are finite. The resources used in our example here in our park project can't be used in another project at the same time. So opportunity cost, as I said, is just the value of the next best alternative that's given up when a choice is made. And so you can think about this in terms of yourselves, the value you would have gained today by staying home. You may have watched Game of Thrones reruns in preparation for the next season. So the value you would have gained by staying home and watching Game of Thrones reruns is the opportunity cost of you being here today. Clearly, you all valued being here today and listening to me more than you did watching Game of Thrones reruns or whatever else you would have been doing, or you would not have invested your time in doing this. So the opportunity cost of, for example, the steel that's used in the park project is the value that would have been realized in an alternative public or private project, which, as I said in the last slide, is very difficult to ascertain without sort of recourse to looking at prices, profits, and these sorts of metrics that private entrepreneurs have. So, we can think a private entrepreneur may have built a skyscraper or may have improved bridges or may have done a lot of other things with that steel that's instead being tied up in the park project. And the value of that skyscraper or those bridges or whatever can be quantified in dollar terms because it's a market transaction. But the value of the park project is not as easily quantifiable in dollar terms. And so it's harder, very, very much harder, to evaluate, is the park project the best use of those resources, or is it not the best use of those resources? Without recourse to the price mechanism, political actors have a very hard time making that sort of a determination. And I think it's worth caveating, this doesn't mean that the park project is not valuable, or that any given sort of government or politically sponsored project is not valuable. It's just hard to sort of make a clear valuation of that type of project. So the last sort of point that I want to touch on here before turning over to sort of real classroom type activities is this Tan-Stoffel principle. Has anyone heard of the Tan-Stoffel principle? Okay, so we have a couple people. It's bad grammar, and it always bugs me. It should be Tan-Stoffel. It means there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. And so it's absolutely true that government provides some valuable goods and services to its citizens, and provides them free of charge. We can think of roads, museums, school, bridges, tons of different things that the government provides. And in arguing for, the provision of these different things, you can drive on roads for free. You can go to museums for free. Public schools, obviously you pay for these things through their taxes, or through your taxes. But at the point of sort of purchase, there's zero priced goods and services. But economists recognize that there is really no such thing as free. Just because something is free does not mean it's not costly in some way. There are always opportunity costs to the resources employed in these free government projects. And these opportunity costs are often, I don't want to say ignored, but at least underplayed in political discussions. So there are physical resources, human resources, the tax dollars that have to be collected to provide these so-called free goods and services. These all have alternative uses. And again, without recourse to the price mechanism, it's very hard to ascertain whether these, the goods and services employed in these government projects are really the best use of those resources, or if there may be a better use, either public or private, for those resources. This absolutely doesn't mean, I've been very critical throughout this discussion of sort of government provision, but I don't want to sort of leave the impression that government should do nothing, but it's at least worth recognizing that all government actions have both benefits and costs, and by using sort of a market-like framework to make sense of government activities, we can better evaluate whether these different projects are worthwhile or not, or at least recognize that it's difficult to sort of ascertain the value of these projects and difficult to determine their worth in the same way that you can determine sort of the value of a market project. And so I think that's the last slide that I have on sort of the background information here. And so I'm going to turn to some classroom activities here to illustrate this. The first sort of classroom activity I thought up here is thinking through those incentives. And so what you do in this activity is you ask your students to imagine that you want a fantastic context. For the next year, 90% of your spending is going to be subsidized. So when you go to the store, you're only responsible for paying 10% of the total bill. And so you can ask, what are some of the things you would buy? How would your spending habits change? And so I'll ask you guys, if 90% of your spending were subsidized, would you buy more of some things? Would you buy some different things? You want to throw out an answer of something concrete? Buy a truck? What kind of truck? Chevrolet? Would you maybe buy more than one truck? I mean, you're only paying 10% of the overall bill here.
No, because I'd probably go play golf somewhere like at Pebble Beach or someplace like that.
Okay, so instead you'd be able to buy the truck and play golf at Pebble Beach, which is something that, you may not be doing now. Anyone else? Yeah.
You buy everything and then you resell it.
Oh, I like that. So yeah, you're not even paying 10% of the total bill. You're actually turning a profit. I like that. Entrepreneurial spirit. Yeah.
I'd buy a fleet of dualies, lease them out for long hauls and short hauls.
Yeah, we've got some entrepreneurial spirits in this room who are going to turn a profit on this. I love it. You can kind of probe your students to think through how their spending habits would change if they were only footing 10% of the overall bill here. And once you've kind of explored some of those ways that spending habits would change, you can explain how this is really how a lot of public projects operate, and projects in the public sector. But it's not that, you're footing only 10% of the overall bill on any given, project that you prefer. The actual amount any single taxpayer contributes to the production of any good or service that they desire is pennies. It's not 10%, it's pennies. So this helps sort of explain how, in a very concrete way, the overall amount spent by government can be much higher than if taxpayers were required to bear the full cost of that good or service or for any single project. And so, you can think of tons of projects that you would love to have, subsidized through government or through anyone if you weren't footing the entire bill here. So again, as I mentioned early, this really helps explain in a very concrete way how people can simultaneously want more stuff from government, but get very, very upset when you see your tax bill just rising and rising and rising. So it's a good sort of softball way to kind of start a discussion here. So the next thing that I have here is a game, and I'm not just teasing by saying candy. I actually do have candy, and if Ray or Liz or someone could help me. So this game, promised I'd take a mic if I were traveling. So this game helps really show how, here we'll go with this one. So if you could hand out, let me make sure that's the right one. Yeah, one of these bags to each person here. So this game really helps show how voluntary trade makes everyone better off, but political trades can create winners and losers. It can, those concentrated benefits are certainly better off. But there are also the people who don't want these sorts of goods and services, or don't want to be taxed in order to provide these goods and services, can be made worse off in some way. And also shows how trade or how the total value to society can be lower under political trades. So for this exercise, you need a bag of mixed candy. And I've gone ahead and divided out, 3 pieces of candy into each bag here, just to make this go a little quicker. But so each student in your classroom gets 3 pieces of candy, and you want to make it unbalanced. I sent my husband out last night, and he came back with all chocolate, so I had to go this morning and get some other candies to disperse into here. But I'm guessing no one has, a set of candies that they totally love. Maybe you do. Maybe you got lucky. You do. Okay, so we have one person who loves the set of candies in their bag. So the first step here is asking students, maybe you've played the trade game before. The beginning here is just a straight up trade game. You ask students to rate on a 1 to 10 scale how much they value the bundle of candy they have in their hands. With the lower values, I don't really like this bundle very much, and values closer to 10, or I really like the value or the bundle of candies I have in my hand. And then you tally up how much value is in the room, and I say write it on the board. I don't know if anyone uses boards anymore, but I'm going to ask Liz to help me here. Got a spreadsheet. And I'm going to ask each of you, if I get my password right. All right, if you could just write down the number they give you. So I'll ask each of you to rate on a 1 to 10 scale how much you value the bundle of candies in your hands. 1. 1. 1. Wow.
9.
9. 2. 2.
8.
8.
9.
9. Okay, interesting. And you had some candies over here. 7? All right. So that's the first step here. Now, again, we're going to do a straight up trade game. So you can go around the room. It looks like we had a lot of people who were relatively unhappy with their candies. So go ahead and trade for a couple minutes, and you can trade as many times as you want. You can make 2-to-1 trades, 3-to-1 trades. There can be no trading, and I say this in the book, but not in here. No trading for something outside the game. You can't say like, I'll buy you a pop if you give me all of your, stuff. So we're going to trade, and then we're going to, again, tally up the value of the bundle of candies in your hand. It looks like we've pretty much got all of our trades have been enacted here. So I'll go around once again and see how people rate, again, just a straight up version of the trade game, how people rate the bundle of candies in their hands. Still a 1, okay?
I'd say
9.
I'm gonna say 7.
7. 1.
9.
Still a 9.
7.
7.
9.
9.
7. 10.
10.
7.
7. Okay. So I think even without Liz tallying up here, we can tell that the total value of the candies, without creating anything new, the total value of the candies in the room has risen. So by 20 points. Okay. So pretty cool. Straight up trade game. You can see that trade makes everyone better off. I don't know if you have played a trade game before, but the kind of things that I like to discuss here is that ask students why they traded. So generally, or if anyone chose not to trade. So generally, you're only going to engage in a trade if you view yourself as being better off as a result of the trade. I'm curious how you ended up with a 1.
It's all Starburst.
It's all Starburst, and you just didn't want to trade off any of your Starburst?
Well, I had Reese's in there too, so I trade out the Reese's.
Okay.
I mean, it's all going with the kids, so it doesn't matter.
That's true. Okay. Well, you at least got no worse off as a result of the trade. People aren't going to engage in trades if they view themselves as being worse off in some way as a result of the transaction. Did anyone choose not to trade? Generally people are only going to choose not to trade in the trade game if they already view themselves as having a very highly rated bundle of candies in their hands. And was anyone unhappy as a result of their trade? It's a related question. People tend to only trade in a marketplace if they view themselves as being better off as a result of the trade, and so no real rational person would make themselves actively unhappy as the result of a trade here. So I'm going to have you put all the candy from the first round away, so that's not going to be sort of rated in the second round here. So in this next step, I'll get this mic again, you ask the students to put the candy under their desks, and now we've got, in the classroom you would distribute 3 pieces of candy, but for interest of time, I've gone ahead and I've been the candy redistribution czar, or I guess the chair of the Bureau of Candy Redistribution here. And I've already taxed 1 piece of candy away from you. So I'm gonna have Liz hand those out. So what you would do is you'd hand each student 3 pieces of candy, and then you'd pick a student in the classroom to be your chair of the Bureau of Candy Redistribution. And once everyone had 3 pieces of candy in front of them, the chair of the Bureau of Candy Redistribution would come around and tax 1 piece of candy from each student, and the students don't get to pick. That chair can go, and you may really, really like Reese's, but that chair came and grabbed that Reese's away from you. So I've already been the chair. I've already taxed the candy away from you, so you've just ended up with 2 pieces of candy here. And so you put this in a bowl or just stick that at the front of the room. And now we're going to have Liz once again. We're going to ask you to rate the bundle of these 2 candies in your hands. And then we'll allow you to trade with you can continue to, just sort of building on the analogy here. People, after they're taxed, continue to produce goods and services in the economy. And this is actually, pretty accurate. You've got 33% taxation. 1/3 of your candy's been taxed away. But you can trade and you can engage in, all sorts of economic activities with the 66, 67% of resources you have left. So now, how do you rate the value of candies?
1.
1, 2, 3,
0.
0. Ooh.
7.
7, 1,
2.
2,
10.
10,
1.
1,
I ain't trading this.
I give it a 5.
a 5. Okay. All right. So it seemed like we had actually a little lower, and it's good to do this second round with only 2 after you've done a round with only 3, because you're probably going to rate a bundle with 3 more highly than you're going to rate a bundle with 2. So again, you can trade now for a couple of minutes, and so I'll let you trade and see if we can raise that value of candies in the room here.
No, I'll trade with you. Yeah, we're gonna have problems.
You're not trading. Oh man, you must be really happy with your
It looks like trades are kind of wrapping up. And so now I'm transferring over my candy redistribution chair powers to Liz over here so I can keep talking. And she's going to take the candy that in your classroom demonstration you would have had the candy redistribution czar or chair of the bureau or whatever have taxed away from your students. So there are 10 pieces of candy here because there are 10 pieces in the room. And the candy redistribution chair has a lot of discretion in this game. She retrieves the tax candy and she can redistribute it back to you, but not everyone's going to get, a piece. She can choose to give a couple pieces to one person, no pieces to some people. She could dump all of it on one person and, have some great windfall to one person. So Liz has distributed the candy here. And I'm going to go around again and have you guys rate the value of candies in your hands. The 3, now that you've got 3, or if you've only got 2, Liz may not have given you any.
Okay.
No.
Slowest scores you gave is a 0 or 1?
0.
Well, this hurts my dental work, so I'll get a 0.
0, okay.
I'll go 2.
2,
6.
6, 5,
7.
7, 0,
5.
oh, 5,
8.
8.
5. I get like a 16. Can I do that?
I think you can give it 10.
I'll take it as a 10.
A 10, but a very, vociferous 10 here. All right, so how many of you were better off in this second round than in the first? And by second round, I mean when you started out with 2 candies than when you started out with 3 candies. How many of you were better off in this second round of trading than in your first round of the game, where you had your full resources? Okay, so 4 people were better off in the second round, but that means 6 people were worse off in the second round. And so, as I say here, that seemed likely. I made this prediction beforehand, but it seemed like it would almost universally bear out. The total value in the room will likely be lower than it was after the first round of voluntary trade without taxation than with voluntary trade with taxation. And Liz is shaking her head. She can empirically verify that when you are taxed and not allowed to employ your resources in the way that you see fit, the total value in the room is lower than it was in the round where you were able to trade with your full set of resources. And so as we saw very clearly in this demonstration, government actions created some winners. There were 4 people who were certainly better off in the second round than they were in the first round. But it also created a wide number of losers in the room who were worse off as a result of the tax and redistribution scheme. And so this is a very visceral way to illustrate sort of the problems of redistribution, as well as the potential benefits of redistribution. But as I said in the last point on sort of my illustration of the premises here, you know, it's worthwhile. We're using this market language to understand political actions and interactions in order to understand in a very visceral way that government activities, while they have some benefits, absolutely have some costs, and we need to evaluate those as well. And so I think this is a very cool way of illustrating that. You know, we've discussed, I discussed sort of throughout this section that you know, we can simultaneously want more spending on the projects that we like, but really dislike the fact that taxes are getting higher and higher. So this video kind of shows that.
Let's say you design a policy that takes 1 penny from 1 million people, and it gives that $10,000 to 1 person. Who's going to know about this policy? Are any of the million going to even notice? I bet you the guy who gets 10,000 will. I'm Ben Powell, a professor of economics at Suffolk University. Here we have politicians promising to cut spending, which voters generally want. But that's a dispersed benefit. When they actually pick the specific programs, that's a concentrated cost. Let's do some real back-of-the-envelope calculations here. There's roughly 300 million people in the United States. Roughly half of them are registered to vote. That's 150 million. If half of them show up in any given national election, that's about 75 million. For your vote to change the outcome of an election, it would have to be exactly 37,500,000 to 37,500,000, and you showing up at the polls makes it 37,500,001 to tip the outcome so that you actually get a different result. What's the likelihood of that happening? Near zero. In fact, economists have figured out you're more likely to die in a car accident on the way to the polling place than to change the outcome of a major national election. As a result, voters are massively ignorant of the policies and their politicians, and it makes sense. But a lot of interest groups are very well informed about policies, not all of their politicians' policies, but those policies that specifically affect them. Farmers who get farm subsidies have a big incentive to know which politicians support their subsidies and how much they're getting. As a result, they not only know about it, but give money to the campaigns to help these people get elected and make sure they stay in favor of the favored subsidies. Meanwhile, spread across the food cost of an average American, it's a trivial amount of money, so most Americans don't even know or feel this cost. And if they do, they hear some general ad on television that talks about how farmers are good for America, and they feel good about this inefficient policy. These same interest groups that lobby to get their benefits, lobby to keep their benefits. This is the logic of politics, and this is why we end up with more spending than the average voter usually wants.
All right, so you know that's a good sort of video, a nice short video with Ben there explaining that logic of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs that we discussed earlier. And so, you know, I enjoy classroom discussions, and I think a great follow-up question to this video is to ask, why is it that incentives to cut spending are so different in the private sector than they are in the public sector? You know, this really discusses that logic in the public sector, but as I kind of focused on in my discussion of the principles of public choice here, it's those incentives that are built into the political system that make the outcome so different, that make, you know, the implications of self-interest so different in politics than in markets. So, you know, drawing it very concretely to a private versus sort of a public discussion or a public setting is a good way to sort of stimulate discussion here. So when a family is spending more money than they should, it's common to see them cut back on their consumption. But as Powell explains, this same tendency isn't present in the public sector. And so sort of exploring why is this not the case is really useful for drawing out how those incentives differ and why those incentives differ, and sort of the tendencies built into the public sector that make the outcomes so different when overspending and continually higher levels of spending occur in a family versus in sort of a polity. So the key point here to sort of emphasize is that families are spending their own money, and so they're directly impacted by poor financial decisions. So when they're overspending, you can overspend for a short period of time, but eventually you're going to feel, the pain of those sorts of decisions. But politicians are spending other people's money, and so they feel no direct impacts of that overspending. And so again, this is why I drill down on those incentives so hard. Their incentives to rein in spending are almost non-existent. Your constituents may look and say, well, I want my taxes to be lower, but again, at the same time, if you have constituents who want particular spending on particular types of projects, politicians are forced to evaluate the costs and the benefits. Will I get more sort of bang for my buck by spending more and appeasing the people who want the wetlands conservation projects or the agricultural subsidies or these sorts of things? Or will I better, have a better chance of being elected if I appease people who want their spending cut? And very often, as I said, politicians are more likely to hear those arguments in favor of particular types of spending than the sort of diffuse arguments of, we would like our taxes cut. And so since they don't feel any direct impact of overspending, and their incentives are to sort of cater to their constituents' interest to get sort of reelected, this sort of helps explain how the dynamics of this overspending emerge over time. And so drawing those parallels between private and public sector spending habits, I think, is a really useful way of looking at the issue. So I've got another game here, and I won't play it out to the full scale, but we'll do like a mini version of this. As I've said again and again, every choice, public and private, entails both benefits and costs. And so this game really gets at those opportunity costs of government spending. And as I keep saying, very often in politics, the costs are ignored. It's easy and it's sort of attractive for politicians to play up the benefits. You get elected when you play up the benefits. But it's really important to realize that every sort of action, every political or private action has an opportunity cost. And so this game helps illustrate those opportunity costs in a very concrete way. So the first step here is just you tell the students that the state government is considering temporarily raising the sales tax by 0.5 cent in order to raise $500 million for a new project. They have yet to define what the project is, but they have a couple of good ideas here. And you can tinker with that. It's been pointed out to me that for some of these, 500 million may not be enough to move the needle, but it's a good starting point. So they're considering a few different sorts of projects that they could fund with this new revenue. And so when I do this in class, I really like to play it up. So you get the first honorable senator up there, and they say, well, a new professional football stadium would be so good for our state. Just think of the jobs it would bring in, not just in construction of the football stadium, but in staffing the football stadium. We'd have food vendors inside the stadium, people selling merchandise, and you'd have other sorts of businesses spring up around the stadium. People may want to go out to dinner beforehand, and that would stimulate the restaurant industry, and people may want to do a variety of different things before they go into the stadium. And so this would really be a net benefit if we were for the economic activity of the area, if we were to build this new football stadium. The first senator sits down, and then the second senator comes up and says, well, I couldn't agree more with the first honorable senator, but I really think what we need to invest this new money in is increasing funding for public education. Kids are our future, and they can't learn effectively if they don't have the right tools. And so, we need to invest in not just STEM-type education, but also new facilities. And, this is really the way that we're going to sort of build a good future workforce. This isn't just a short-term investment. This is really an investment in the long-term viability of the state. And so, everyone claps and the second senator sits down, and the third senator stands up and says, well, while I agree wholeheartedly with the first two honorable senators from Texas, I really think, our infrastructure is a mess. Civil Society of Engineers gives us like a D in infrastructure in the state of Texas. And so how can we say that we are really a modern, high-functioning state if we have such shoddy infrastructure? So we need to invest not just in improving our roads and bridges, but also public transit in urban areas. And this is really what's going to turn us into, a real economic powerhouse going forward. So he sits down and everyone claps, and the fourth senator gets up and says, I really think we should trust people to make the right decisions with their money. Let's not raise taxes. I think instead we should allow people to save that money and invest it in the projects of their choosing. And this, may seem like more of a roundabout way, but this is really the way that we're going to spark economic activity in our state. And so, everyone claps and the fourth senator sits down. So these are really the four projects that are on the table for, using the new revenue that will be collected by that half-cent increase in sales taxes. And so at the beginning of the class, you may want to have it written on the whiteboard or in big Post-its around the room, have each alternative listed and in one corner of the room or at the front of the room, and have students come up and write their names next to or under those preferred choices. And it's important to have them write their names, because then if no one's, raising their hands to answer why they picked that thing, you can say, hey, Sarah, you wrote under public infrastructure spending. Why did you do that? And so after students have come up and, picked out the option they would choose, you can discuss with students why they picked each particular choice. The real point to sort of illustrate here is that each of these choices has merits. I tried to make a good argument for each of these choices, any real senator who's arguing for these options would have done. And so each of these choices definitely have their merits, but each of these choices, very concretely in this example, entails giving up the other alternatives. If you spend the money on public education, you can't spend it on infrastructure. If you spend it on infrastructure, you can't spend it on the stadium. And so there are opportunity costs to every government action. And this is a very, very concrete way of illustrating that fact. So after asking students why they would, choose each of these particular things, it's just an interesting follow-up question. What they think what choice they think the legislature would actually make. And in drawing out this idea, this logic of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs that we saw in the last video, and that I've discussed sort of a little bit earlier, it's interesting to ask what sort of concentrated interests would be pushing for each of these. We might think that truckers and other people who tend to use the roads and the bridges a lot would be very willing to push for the public infrastructure. Educators are going to push for education, but it's worth drawing out some other, parents may be more interested in education. And, this sort of helps illustrate also concretely those dynamics of, not only are there opportunity costs of engaging in these different types of activities, but there are interests that are very interested in seeing each of these things, these pass. And, catering to one interest means disappointing another interest. And so those are the sorts of evaluations that politicians have to make in deciding which type of legislation to pursue. Which we'll discuss a little bit more in the second part of this two-part series on public choice. And so the final game that I have here is drawing out that Tan-Stoffel principle. What are the costs of these free goods? Again, the Tan-Stoffel idea is there ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Maybe using the ain't helps you remember it a little bit better. I'll concede to that, but it still bugs me. But the intuition here is really powerful. So in this sort of activity, you're asking students to really think through the alternative uses of resources, the opportunity costs that are entailed in providing these so-called free goods. I would maybe write these on the board or have it in a PowerPoint or something. Well, think about, free public museums. You can go to any of the Smithsonian's in DC at $0 ticket price at the door. Most roads that we travel on are not toll roads. We have a few more around, Dallas, but you can avoid toll roads if you want to and just drive on the public roads. So at the point of purchase, any public roads are zero priced. Public transportation, the postal service, all of these free or very low priced government provided goods, there are alternative uses of those resources, both physical resources and human resources. That are used in these goods and services. And so, sort of asking students, well, maybe I'll just ask you all, so let's think about maybe public museums. What are some of the real resources that are tied up in a public museum?
Land, buildings, and people.
Land, buildings, and people, absolutely. And I was going to say sort of human resources as well. What are some of the alternative uses that those land, buildings, and people could be put to?
Skyscraper.
Hmm?
We could tear them down and put skyscrapers up.
Put skyscrapers, which may not be as pretty in some, cases, but would certainly employ more people. And again, I'm getting it. There are benefits to these things, but, there are also alternative uses that
They could put the museum on the floor of the skyscraper, and the rest of the skyscraper would be leased out.
Sure.
And it'd be profitable and make money.
Because one difficulty you really run into with something like a museum, especially in a place like, DC, is that land is so valuable. And so, the land that I came here from DC, which is why I use it as an example, but, that land could be employed for business or for a variety of other things. But I love the Smithsonian's. I went to the Smithsonian's a lot when I lived in DC. It was wonderful. But there are alternative uses of those lands, buildings, and people, like commerce or other sorts of projects that could, these could be used for. There are benefits to all of these things. We like public museums, we like public roads, but it's worth thinking through the opportunity costs of those resources that are employed, both human and physical. And these opportunity costs should not be ignored, even though they often are in sort of discussions about public spending, which is another reason why we see sort of this secular increase in public spending over time. The choice between public and private provision is never an all or nothing choice either. So for every case that I listed, and very deliberately listed those examples, because there are both public and private providers of museums and roads and, package delivery services. And so it could be useful if this conversation is a little too abstract for students to think in very concrete terms. What resources would be necessary to provide an additional museum, an additional road? And this conversation is really, again, meant to illustrate to students that even when something is provided for free, there are these opportunity costs, and it's worth thinking through them. And so I'll open it up for questions at this point, if there are any. Yeah?
What about the tension between cutting taxes and debt?
Cutting taxes and debt? I guess what specific question are you asking? There's certainly a tension. You're just shifting.
Do you have anything on that?
I don't have anything on that in there. I kind of tried to keep my discussion pretty high level, but I mean, an obvious sort of response to that, I think, is that engaging in sort of debt or deficit financing is just pushing the problem onto future generations. And so it's the same problem. It's an exaggerated form of the problem, actually. Not only are you not currently paying, for these sorts of projects, but you're paying an even smaller percentage because you're pushing that onto, future people who may or, you may or may not know.
Like with the new tax bill, I mean, there are some winners and some losers,
Mm-hmm.
and they say it's going to be a lot more debt, a lot more. So it would be nice to illustrate that. I was
Yeah.
just thinking that.
That would be a good. I mean, I tried to kind of keep it very high level in this discussion here, but I think that would definitely be something worth bringing about, and especially in the context of the new tax bill. My gosh, like drawing it into something so concrete and so timely would be a really, really good illustration of public choice. And in the literature, I mean, that's a huge part of the public literature is talking about different metrics of financing and ways that you can kind of camouflage spending in order to make it, more like politicians. They've got one job, to get reelected so they can do the things that they want to do. And so if you can provide benefits but camouflage the spending, then you're a really, attractive wizard of a politician. And so deficit financing and engaging in sort of building up debt is a great way to camouflage the spending while still showing I'm providing these benefits to you and you should vote for me because I provided these benefits. Yeah.
Yeah, how do you prevent, in a free market economy, individuals and businesses, say like the oil industry, from influencing politicians to pass legislation that benefits them in an energy situation? How do you actually prevent that from happening when there's golf courses everywhere?
Right.
And people transact hands at $10,000 per hole. How do you do that?
Absolutely. Great question. And that's something that I touch on a little bit more in the part 2 of the public choice here. This is a huge area of literature, and it was hard to kind of build it all in. But there's this idea of entangled political economy, that it's basically impossible to totally separate. In this conversation, I've kept the political and the market very separate. But in reality, you have these really entangled relationships between political actors and market actors. And so keeping them separate is sort of a logical fiction that we use in the Blackboard space. And so you say, how do we keep these things from happening? My sort of glib answer is shrinking the scale of government.
This per hole, so where you videotape politicians meeting with business leaders in the oil industry and other industries, and then you say, well, hey, there's money transpired in that hole?
I think that would capture I think that's a huge problem. So I think that would capture a very small percentage of people who are engaging in these types of activities. I think a lot of these trades between political and market actors are much more ambiguous. And so, legislation can be written in such a way that it seems vague, but it's, really helping certain interests. And so the only real way to keep that sort of stuff from happening is to remove power from the hands of the political, because market actors have a higher incentive to be scrupulous, if their bottom line depends on it. Political actors don't have the same sorts of incentives. And so I think that's one of the major reasons why you see those sorts of activities going on. But how you actually lessen the scope of government activities or the scale of government activities is another huge problem. So I don't know if there's certainly not an easy answer on how to do that. But I think it's definitely worth acknowledging that, on the Blackboard, we separate the political and the market, but, there's a lot of these sorts of interactions going on. Yeah.
Well, isn't the root of that problem that those laws that the federal government is making that benefits businesses, that causes what a crony capitalism, isn't that the fact that they're doing things that are basically not constitutional? I mean, there's not constitutional authority to do those things, but as long as we look the other way, all of that stuff is going to happen, and it's thought of as legal. It's not that it's underhanded.
Right. And that's what, I kind of said the problem is the scale and the scope of what we allow, government to do. And so in the next section, I'll talk a little bit about, rent seeking, giving, favors to, politicians giving favors to preferred market actors. And, because the scope of what political actors can do is so large, it's attractive and it's rational in many ways for people in markets to engage in those sorts of activities. If the benefits are there, it's rational to spend some resources to try to get those benefits. And so, I really am sort of hesitant to blame markets for that problem, when it's really the fact that those prizes are being, such enormous prizes are being offered, makes it rational for people in markets to go after those sorts of prizes. So yeah, I think that's again, you know, I think a big part of the problem is that governments are doing things that they should maybe not be doing, but I don't know how to improve that problem. Yeah.
All right, so you have the government giving benefits, you know, let's say to minorities, okay? And the excuse behind it is like, well, you know, they're human beings and they need help, you know? So how do you balance that, you know? Like you have these people that need help,
Right.
and you have government taking away money from other people, just, you know,
Right.
pouring benefits to somebody else.
I think, you know, in that last game, where there's no such thing as free, I tried to, you know, sort of illustrate that there are, in most of those examples I gave, private and public solutions. And I think in most examples that we can think of, you know, maybe not national defense or the police powers, like there are some functions that we generally like to have in the hands of government, or that a lot of reasonable people should agree should be provided by the government, some limited set of public goods as well. But on those areas where we disagree, I think it's important to think about, you know, there are private solutions to these sorts of things, you know, as well. If you think about like Catholic Charities of America, or, you know, there are private examples. And I think one question I explore a lot in my own research is looking at where the public provision of goods and services has crowded out the private provision of these sorts of things. You know, people don't think, you know, to provide certain goods and services because they think, well, you know, the government is providing social welfare services, or the government is providing these sorts of services. You know, in past eras, you know, some of these things, particularly welfare services, were provided, I don't want to say privately, but through sort of charitable organizations. And so, you know, this dichotomy between market and politics is a little Spartan, you know, a little bit difficult to attain. You know, there's this third sector of sort of the charitable sector, which is, you know, really neither market nor government, that exists and provides some of those things. And I think an interesting question is, absent government provision, how much would people in those sectors be incentivized to provide these sorts of things? It's a difficult question to answer, but I think it's one way to get at that issue.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. All right, well, that looks like all of the questions. Thank you so much, and you'll hear from me again soon.